Okay, so we are discussing about the routing in Web API project. So we have seen two types of routing. One is attribute-based routing and another is convention-based routing, sometimes also called as the centralized routing. So if you are using ASP.NET MVC framework, then we are accustomed to use of convention-based routing, wherein we define the root template and define the additional optional parameter, or we can set the default values for the controller class or the parameters. In addition to that, we can use the attribute routing to override the convention-based routing. So to individually for each action method, we can specify where to invoke that action method. Right. So let us continue with the discussion of the routing in our Web API framework. Okay, so let me share my screen. Yeah, so we have seen that how to define the roots. One is, so in this example, we defined the two roots. Yes. This is the first root and this is the second root, right? And we also seen how to define the controller action methods. So depending upon the name of the action method, the appropriate, and depending upon the type of HTTP request, appropriate action method will be invoked. So if you get request, so the get request conflict can be resolved depending upon whether we are passing the ID or not. So if we pass the ID, then this method will be executed. If we do not provide the ID, then this method without any argument will be executed. So there will not be any conflict, but it will be able to identify the correct action method to execute when there is a HTTP GET request. If the HTTP POST request, this method will be executed. If there is a PUT, then this method. And if there is a HTTP delete request, then this method will be executed. Similarly, we can have the CRUD operations implemented on our entities. And see that here, by default, this value controller class is annotated with the authorize attribute, so that we can give the authorization to a selected people having certain roles. So role-based authorization is possible in Web API framework. So suppose this controller class action method should be executed by the employee of the HR department only or finance department only, then you can set this via the authorization attribute. But right now we are not doing so. So that's why we will comment out that field and then we will build the application and run the application. So these are very simple method containing returning the two strings or array of strings containing two values, and this one will return the static value. And right now these are empty methods. So if we run our web API application, then it will be hosted on the local IIS Express Edition. Our path is API/value. So this will match with what we have defined, like API/controller/ID. So here ID is just a minute. So here you can see that API is the literal word, then controller will match with the values controller, and because ID is optional, then it will try to find out the respective method. So there are two methods: get without ID and get with ID. So this will invoke the get method without the ID. So if you look at, if you go back to our controller, so here this get method without ID will be executed. It will return an array of strings containing two values, value 1 and value 2. Right. So it will return an array of strings. If you provide the ID as the parameter to this our URL, then only a static string will be returned. Static string will be returned, right? So irrespective of the ID that you pass, okay, irrespective of the ID that you pass over here, always it is the same string will be returned, because we are not checking for the ID. Simply hard-coded string will always be returned. Now we can slightly modify the existing code. We will have a list of strings. Okay, we define a static list of string, right? Having three values, value 0, 1 and 2. And this get method will return the entire list. This get method will return the value stored at particular index. And now this is the example where our method name doesn't begin with the HTTP verb. Here it begins, say the action method is create record. But since we have annotated this method with the HTTP post, that means whenever there is a HTTP post request, this action method will be executed. So here the idea is whatever the data coming from the client, the string value, whatever that value should be added to our list. Okay, should be added to our static list of string, right? Now there is a convention that by default this value could be primitive or complex. So suppose we are passing a product object, then it is a complex type. But if we are passing only ID or product name or category, then these are the primitive type. It could be integer, string, float, double, date, and so forth. So in that case, by default, the web API framework will assume that primitive types are expected from the URL. Okay. From the URL, it will expect the primitive type. But if the user is passing the complex data, then user must pass as part of the HTTP request body. Okay, so let us see that if we have this is our HTTP message containing request and this is the header, this is the body. Right. So if this value is primitive, here it is primitive value because it is string. If it is a primitive data type, then we are expecting to be part of the URL. But if the type is suppose product, employee, student, then it will be expecting it as part of the body. So this is by convention. But if you want to override that, then you can use these properties like from body. So because I want to override that, I'm expecting this data to be part of the body instead of coming from the URL query string parameter. Okay, so instead of it is coming from the body, instead of coming it from the header, we are expecting that it should come from the body. So you can use this from body to override the default behavior of the web API framework. By default, the primitive types are expected into the URL and the complex data type are expected as part of the request body. Similarly, because the action method name is put, it will always match the HTTP put request. And whenever we want to update the record, so at that particular location, then we can use this put. So basically, we are updating the value at the index ID. And finally, delete. For delete, I want to delete the record stored at this particular index. Okay, so for the list, you can use the remove at method to remove an element stored at that particular index. So these are the basic CRUD operation. Okay, these are the basic CRUD operations. Okay. So this get methods correspond to retrieve. This post request correspond to create, this update, and finally delete. Okay, is this code clear? Any doubt in this code? This is a simple code for performing the CRUD operations on the static list of values, string values. Any doubt so far? Okay, fine. So we build the project and then we run it, and whenever we are providing this API/values, it will match with get without any parameter, right? And we get the three values, value 0, 1, and 2. So array of string. If you provide the ID as the parameter, then we get the respective value stored at that particular index. Okay, so there are three values with the index 0, 1, and 2. So we are getting the value at the index 1. Okay, so this is the value that we are receiving. Okay. And you can use the Fiddler or a Postman tool, or you can use the browser developer tools to issue the request other than get. Okay, so I think this is the font size is too small, but you can try it out. So let me directly open the image. Hope that now the font size is more readable. So in the Fiddler tool, you can go to the Compose tab, and then you can specify the type of the request and select the URL, and then you can click on the execute button. On the left hand side panel, you will get the output. Okay, so get request API slash values slash 1. So I want to wish the record at index 1. And on the left hand side, you can see that we are getting the response with the status code 200. If you double click on that response, on the right hand side panel, you will get the entire response message. So it has been already highlighted in the red box, red rectangle. So see that once you double click it, we get this response, and there are multiple tabs. You can see the HTTP response message header. Okay, you can see its content. You can see the data in JSON format or XML format. So right now I have selected the JSON tab. So I want to see the response in the JSON format, and you can see the output is value 1. And on the above, it is the request header. So this is a simple tool through which you can issue the HTTP request. So now we are selecting the post from the drop-down list. Instead of get, now we are selecting post, and the path name is API slash values in our URL. So it will match with the values controller, and post request. So post method. If you remember, we are expecting the data to be passed inside the body. Okay, so that's why the string is inserted inside the request body. And if we click on the execute button on the top right corner, you'll see there is an execute button. And if we click on that, we expect that this will be inserted into our static list. Okay, so this is the response. By default, if it is successful, the response contains the header with the status code 204, no content. But we can change that also. Okay, we can simply change the status code, and description can be changed. But right now we'll go with the default thing. And once again, we issue the get request to see that retrieve whether the new string is inserted inside our static list or not. Okay, so once again we issue the get request, and we fetch the data, and if we click on the response, we'll see that if you look at the JSON value, a new string is inserted in our static list. Okay, and now if I want to update the record at index I, we can use the put method. So select the put verb from the drop down list, and I want to update the record which is stored at index 1. Now one thing we need to change, because now I want to send the data. I think we did it in earlier post. Yes, just here you can see that in the header, we are changing this, we are specifying, because the content type, if you look at the content type is set to application/JSON. So if you want to send the data in JSON format, you can set this request header content type to be application/JSON. If you are sending the XML data, you need to replace it with application/XML. Similarly, when we update it, you will see that content type is set to application/JSON, and our new value for the string is updated string. So I want to update the record at location at index 1 with the new value. The new value is nothing but updated string. To test it, once again we click on the execute button, and once again we get the response 204 no content. This is the default return value, though the operation is successful. And once again we issue the get request to fetch the all the strings, and now you can see in the output that the value 1 is substituted with the updated string. So 4 strings are there. Value 0 instead of value 1, now it is updated string value 2 and the newly inserted string called new string. So using this tool or using developer tools, you can test your API. And while at that time, you need to make sure that your API is running, API is running and it is able to receive this request from any client. And finally, we check for the delete request. So we select the delete option, delete value from the drop down list. Change the URL. I want to delete the string at location 2. Okay, so that is value 0, 1 and 2. So that is value 2. Okay, value 1 is updated with the update string. And right now here it is not required, the content type doesn't matter. Okay, see that while we issue the HTTP delete request, the content type doesn't matter, because ultimately what we want to do, we want to delete the resource, that is the string at index 2. If you issue the request, once again we get the response with the status code 204, no content. And finally we reissue the get request and retrieve all the records. Now the string value 2 is deleted. So now we have only 3 strings, value 0, updated string and new string. Okay, so this is how you can test the existing controller method, and similarly you can update the, you can extend the products API by adding few more action methods for CRUD operations like post, put, delete. Okay. Now we'll see more features of this attribute-based routing, because we have seen that while we define the convention-based routing, you can specify the constraints in form of regex. Using regex, you can specify the additional constraint like the ID must be number, or it is satisfying some regular pattern, regular expression. So now we'll see more features of this attribute-based routing. Using that, you can override the convention-based routing, as well as you can modify the existing routing pattern by using the attribute-based routing. Why it is called attribute-based routing? Because you can write it down immediately before the controller name or before the action method, and you can override or you can specify the route specific to a particular action method. So let us see the example of this. Okay, so now you'll see that in this controller, the controller name is task controller. So we added a new controller called task controller. The task controller has been decorated with the attribute called root prefix. So the root prefix says that the root pattern is API/employee task. That means here we are explicitly stating that this controller should be mapped whenever our URL pattern is like this: API slash employee task, M task. Is it clear what is the reason of root prefix? Whenever this our URL pattern begins with API slash employee task, the web framework, this API framework will map it with the task controller. And for individual methods also, they are decorated with the different roots. So for the root, we are specifying the constraint like ID must be integer and what are the possible values. So there are two methods, get max and get min. That means get max, we can pass the value which can have maximum value of 100. And get min method will be invoked whenever the minimum value of the ID is 101. So within if there is a request is HTTP GET request, so there are two possibilities. Either the get max will be executed or get min will be executed. Depending upon the value of the ID, and the additional constraint is ID must be integer and the minimum or maximum value is 100 or minimum value is 101. So we partition the numbers into two, all the values up to 100 and all the values greater than 100. Is it clear these two methods, get max, get min, and how to use the attribute routes to specify the additional constraints? The ID parameter must be integer and can take on maximum 100 value or minimum 101 value. And in that case, it will return some string. And third method is also there, get, but there we are overriding the default path or overridden path. For the task controller, the path name is API slash employee task. But here for the third get method is the path name is API slash task. Okay, API slash task and new string. So for the other two methods, the ID must be part of the URL and it must be number, integer. But for the third get method, the URL or path name must contain the new string variable with some value. Okay. So remember that when we are we are issuing the HTTP request, at that time, value will always be bytes or text. Okay, it will be always be text. Even though we are using numbers, they will be transferred as the text. So it is the programmer's responsibility to convert it to the appropriate data type. And if it is a complex type, then we have to convert it to the complex object by parsing the data. So if the data is coming as a JSON data or XML data, we need to deserialize the data before we actually operate on the object. Is it clear? These three methods, three action methods? Okay. And the additional constraints that you can specify are like alphabets. If you want to allow only alphabets, if you want to allow only the Boolean values, true or false, if you want to allow the date time value, decimal values only, double, float, or GUID. So these are the additional constraints can be specified while We have used only one, like integer, but other than that, you can use this also. Even you can specify that the parameter or the path name contains some data of specific length. So you can use the constant length. And max and min we have seen. And if it is a string, then it can have max length or min length. If it is the numeric data, you can use the max or min function. But if it is the string data, you can use these two functions, max length or min length. Even the range function, you can specify the complete range between the two values. And you can finally customize your pattern via the regex. Okay, you can use the regex to completely customize the pattern. Okay. For the third method, you can see the path name. It is tilde/API/task/new string. So we'll see that right now we are looking at this constant, and now this is our URL. So in this URL, we are specifying API/employee task/33. So it's basically a GET request. And since the value is max value is the value is 33, so get max will be called because maximum value is 100 allowed for this get max method. Because now it will follow the root prefix for the entire controller. Okay, for the entire controller, all the action method within that controller, our path name must be /API/employee task. Okay, M tasks. Similarly, if the value is then 100, suppose it is 123, then get min method will be called because the constant is minimum value is 101. So any value greater than or equal to 101 should match the get min method. And finally, the third get method. Okay, so here see that if the value is non-numeric, so it's a string ABC, which is not an integer, then this error message will be received. You can see that no resource was found that matches the request because we have the two method, get method, but there we have provided the constant that they must be integer. And additional constant is minimum or maximum value. Okay, so the error message is directly received by the client in case if it doesn't match with any of the action method. And now you can see the API/task because for the third get method, the URL pattern must be API/task instead of API/employee. And the new string will have value 10. Okay, new string will have value 10 because it is passed as the parameter. So this is your answer, Priyank. For the third get method, we have overridden the URL pattern. Instead of API/employee task, we are overriding via the root attribute with the properties API/task and parameter is new string, which is whatever we pass. So remember, though we are writing 10, actually it goes as a string. So that's why I have written number to clarify that to the client, the data will be passed as a text. So on the server side, on the service side, we have to take care that for validation should be done on the service side. Even though it is 10, actually it will be treated as a string 10. Okay, string containing the value 10. And again, see that we are passing the ABC, then new string will be ABC, just to further clarify that the value is either number or string, whatever you pass in, or it is a mixture of alphanumeric characters. They are sent as a text value. Okay, they are sent as a text value or string value. So now for checking for the constraint, we need not write the code. We need not do the typecasting. Simply use the constraints and it will be automatically taken care without writing a additional code. Okay, so we are talking about the data type. So see that in this here in this URL, ABC is the parameter. It may match with the new string of the get method. So you'll see that because new string is of type string, we are expecting the data to come as part of the URL, not the body. But if you want to pass the data as part of the body, then you have to override the default settings. Okay. So by default, these are the assumption for the web API. For the get method, the query string might contain primitive type or complex type. For get method, you cannot pass the body. Okay, you cannot pass the data in body because usually we are expecting the data from the service, from the server. You want to retrieve the data, not to send the data, not to update the data. So that's why request body is always empty. Similarly for delete, if you want to delete the resource on the server side, you are not sending the data. If you want to send the data, they are expected as part of the query string parameter. So whether it is a primitive type or complex type, it should be passed as the query string parameter or as the path name of the URL. But this is not the case for post, put and patch, because now if you pass the data primitive type, it is expected in the query string parameter, and if you pass the complex type, it is expected from the request body. So these are the default assumption of the web API framework. If you want to override, you can override via the attributes from body or from header. Is this table clear? Why? What are the default assumption about the data? The data might be coming from the query string parameter, or it might come from the request body. So this is the default assumption, and we'll see the example to understand in more detail. But this table will briefly explain you how the data should be passed, what are the default assumptions. And if you are expecting the data, suppose you are expecting complex data as the query string parameter, you need to override by writing or by using the attribute over the action method. So let's add a new model class, a product. This is already we have done, but this is the new project. So within the new project, I am adding a product class with ID, name and price. And we are also adding the product controller. So now you can see that we have the static list of product. Remember, don't forget this keyword static in front of this product, because every time we are adding the data, it will be added to the static list. If it is not static, then whatever the data that we have added will be lost. Okay, that's why we are maintaining static list. If you forget this static, if you add the data into the list of product and once again you try to access it, it will be lost, because every time you make a request, a new instance of the controller class will be created. Okay, so if your list is not static, if your product list is not static, every time you make a request, new controller instance will be created, and it will always initialize the product with only 3 items, 3 products. here monitor, keyboard and mouse. So that's why I have specifically highlighted that my list is static, so that even for the subsequent request, the data will be maintained inside the static list to make it available for the subsequent request also. Because every time there is a HTTP request from the browser or any other client, it is stateless. Okay, as you know, the HTTP protocol is stateless. So the server will not remember the past request. There is no connection between the past requests, and that's why we need to resort to the database or some storage for storing the data on this server side. So now you can see there are three get action, get product with the ID, and get product with the name. So depending upon the HTTP GET request, one of the method will be executed. If there are no parameter, first method will be executed. If there is a one parameter, which is an integer, then second method will be executed. If the parameter is string, then third method will be executed. Is this clear? These three methods, I am not explaining the code. It is self-explanatory. Return all the entire product list. Return the product with the ID. So here I am assuming ID to be the index. I am using ID as the index. And in the third case, we can search the product by its name. Okay. So it's a very rough code, or it is a quick and dirty code for testing the API. There is one more action method, get product with ID and name. Okay, so there you can pass the ID and name. Based on that, it will search the product with the given name, and ID. If it is found, then it will return the product. If it doesn't found, then it will return a product which containing the name ID to be 0 and name that product doesn't exist, and with price to be 0. So it will return a dummy product in case of product is not found in the static list. Again, it's a very quick and dirty code to test these different kind of possibilities. Searching the product with the ID, searching the product with the name. If you know both the things, ID and name, then it will try to match both the ID and name and return the product. Now here we will see that what we are returning, complex data type. Okay, what we are returning, complex data type. So product is a complex data type, while integer ID and string names are primitive data type. So if you remember that primitive types are expected from the query string parameter, and complex data types are expected from the request body. In case of post put request, right? And patch additionally. So it will try to match both the ID as well as it will try to match with the name. If it is found, then the particular product will be returned. Otherwise, a dummy product will be returned containing the name that product doesn't exist. Okay, so let's try it within the browser. If we use API/product, it will return 3 product, monitor, keyboard, and mouse. So array of products will be returned. Now see that if I pass the ID as the parameter, then I get the product with the ID 1. Okay, so only the product with the ID 1 will be returned. So once again, you can see that for the get request, this is whether the data is primitive or complex. It should be passed as the query string parameter. If we change the ID to be 3, then we are getting the product with the ID 3, its name and price. And if we pass the product ID to 5, it will return an error message. And basically it is index out of range. So the error handling code is not written, or it is not handled by the code. So that's why it will throw an error, and the entire error message and stack trace will be received by the client. Okay, so now I want to search the product by its name. So I am setting the name parameter to be equal to monitor. So I get the product with the name monitor. So just see how we are changing, how we are passing the data as the query string parameter. If you want to pass more data, you can use the request body. Okay, suppose you want to send the data of a collection of 100 records, then you can pass it as the request body. Because there is a limit of passing the data inside as the query string parameter. If I want to search the product by its name, say keyboard, we get this product with the name keyboard. If you want to search the product by its ID and name, then we get the product with the ID 2 and the name keyboard. But suppose with the product having ID 2 and name mouse doesn't exist, we get the dummy product with the ID 0 and name product doesn't exist. And another way, alternative way to handle the error, what you do, you just send the appropriate status code and the description should be changed. So the status code should be like 404 or your forbidden 501. So there are different status codes are available that you can use it for notifying the client for the appropriate error that has occurred on the service side. Now, if the ID is 3 and name is product name is mouse, then the correct product will be returned. Okay, fine. I think we'll stop at this point, and we'll see the additional code for the other operations like post, put, and delete in the next lecture. If you have any doubt, you can ask the questions before we conclude the session. And finally, we'll enhance our products API with the complete CRUD operations. So far, we added only the get request. Okay, so we are able to only retrieve the records. Right now, we are unable to add product or update the product or delete the product. So now we'll see the code for doing those operations. Okay, fine. Thank you.